If then, in the picture thinking, consciousness, the inwardizing of natural self-consciousness, was the real existence of evil, that inwardizing in the element of self-consciousness is the knowledge of evil as something that is implicit in existence. This knowledge is, of course, a genesis of evil, but only a genesis of the thought of evil, and is therefore recognized as the first moment of reconciliation. For as a withdrawal into itself from the immediacy of nature which is determined as evil, it is a forsaking of that immediacy and a dying away of sin. It is not natural existence as such that is forsaken by consciousness, but natural existence that is at the same time known as evil. The immediate movement of withdrawal into self is just as much a mediated movement, it presupposes itself, or is its own ground. That is to say, the ground of the withdrawal into self is that nature has already withdrawn into itself on account of evil. Man must withdraw into himself, but evil is itself the withdrawal into self. This first movement is, for that very reason, only immediate, or the simple notion of that movement, because it is the same as what its ground is. The movement or othering has therefore still to appear, but in its own more characteristic form. In paragraph 783, which is fairly short, there's some very interesting contrasts or distinctions that are going on here, as well as transitions, movements, Bewegungen, right, that are happening here in the text as we approach the end of the religion section and the culmination of all of this laborious dialectical work. So he says that if then in the picture-thinking consciousness, the Bewusstsein that is using Vorstellen, right, Vorstellungen, picture thinking, which we've talked a lot about, the inwardizing of natural self-consciousness was the real existence of evil. That inwardizing in the element of self-consciousness is the knowledge of evil as something that is implicit in existence. So a lot going on there just in that first sentence. And we see that what we've got here is a number of different contrasts. So picture thinking consciousness, another kind of consciousness, self-consciousness, and what we have to read in here is this universal self-consciousness where self-consciousness is related to its other, and it's being found in the community. And he does use the term element there, right? So we've got a contrast between two different points of view. We have a connection on this inwardizing, innerlich werden to become, right? Innerlich, inwardizing works for that, to become literally something that is inward, innerlich, right? To go from the exterior to the interior, to become more in the interior. And we've got inwardizing here, which could be understood as being the inwardizing of natural self-consciousness, right? It would make sense since it's going to come up in just a little bit. But here it's very explicit, the inwardizing of natural self-consciousness, the self-consciousness that knows itself as an individual, as something embodied in the world. And then we have evil, böse, showing up in two different ways. And we'd be tempted to think, well, the most important way is the real existence. Dasein there is the adjective, Dasein, right, of evil. And, okay, we could even leave off real existence, because real isn't doing any work there in the translation. But then we have the knowledge of evil as such, als solch, right? And so knowledge is in a way more important than just mere existence, right? Especially from an idealist perspective. And then we get something even more interesting here. Knowledge of evil as such, right? So now we're actually getting to what is evil as implicit, an sich, right? In itself, in existence. So it's not just existing evil or evil in existence, it's evil as implicit, as right there in what existence gives us. So where do we go from here then? He says, well, this knowledge is, of course, and here we get the first, you could say, reference to something almost performative in the sense of something by doing something, saying something, thinking something, makes something happen, not just like putting on airs performative as people sometimes interpret that world. So this knowledge, he says, is of course a genesis, a coming into being, a werden, right, of evil, but only a genesis of the thought of evil, and it is therefore recognized as the first moment of reconciliation. Versöhnung, something that we're aiming at by the end of this, and going to see develop yet more once we move past religion into absolute knowing. Reconciliation within the community. So he goes on and he says, as a withdrawal into itself. A withdrawal into itself is zurückgehen, going back into something. And what can it go into? Well, it could go back into the world, but it's actually withdrawing, retreating from the world, you could say. A withdrawal into itself from the immediacy, Unmittelbarkeit, of nature, which is determined as evil. It is a forsaking of that immediacy and a dying away of sin. Now, we've got to be a little bit careful here. Is this a withdrawal into itself away from the entire natural world? No, because the natural world itself is not evil. It's the humanized natural world where humans can realize themselves as evil. And so what do we get? We get a forsaking, a verlassen. And it's interesting because the German here is dasselbe, so forsaking of itself. And Miller translates that here as a forsaking of that immediacy of nature. Now, in a certain way, that's the wrong translation. In a certain way, it's a revealing translation. A forsaking of the, nature that is the nature of the human being, the damaged, selfish, individualized nature, having a body, having desires, all those sorts of things. And then a dying away, absterben, dying in the opposite direction, you could say, to sin, Sünde. So this is how it's overcoming evil. And then he goes on and he says it's not natural existence as such, forsaken by consciousness, right? So it's not even the fact that we, say, have to eat, for example. It's the fact that we have to eat, and that involves us in a certain way with evil. We could be vegans and be like, oh, I only eat the plants. Well, you're still eating the plants. You think the plants want to get eaten up? No, they don't. And if you're a vegan, of course, this is a whole other conversation, but it's not as if you're not complicit in animal cruelty, because all those vegetables that you're eating had to be raised in fields where the plows were chopping up the poor little earthworms and shrews, and pesticides might have been used. Oh, it could have been organic, yes, but even organic things are designed to keep away pests and to eliminate them from the fields. We could go on and on and on. Anything that's distinctively human can be realized not just as good, but as involving us in evil. Natural existence that is at the same time known as evil. So he goes on and then he talks here. We have the withdrawal into self, the Zurückgehen, and now we have the withdrawal into self here that is a different term, in sich gehen, one that we've encountered many times, right, in this religion section. So the being that withdraws into itself, that goes into itself, is involved at the same time with an immediate movement and a mediated movement, right? So he goes on and he says, here we go. The immediate movement of withdrawal into self is just as much a mediated movement. How is it a mediated movement? I mean, every movement is, strictly speaking, a mediated movement. There is nothing that is purely immediate within the Hegelian framework. But how is it immediate here? He says to us, it presupposes itself, or it is its own ground, Grund, foundation. So this is a very interesting, again, we see this, by doing something, it becomes something, right? By preoccupying itself with evil, it shows itself as being involved with evil. It is its own ground, right? And so he says that is to say the ground of the withdrawal into self, the ground of this movement is that nature has already withdrawn into itself. On account of evil, man must withdraw into himself. So that's one side. But evil is itself the withdrawal into self. So by trying to escape the evil, we become more conscious of the evil that we cannot escape from, extricate ourselves from, because the very fact of trying to do that has put us back into the knowledge of evil, a knowledge that is not of evil as out there, but within ourselves. And at the same time, we can have this recognition that we need to die to it, we need to reject it, we need to go away from it. And so he says, this first movement is for that very reason only immediate, or the simple notion, the Begriff, right, the concept of that movement, because it is the same as what its ground is. Having its own ground, being its own ground, is not something that's an advance, it's actually a defect. It's something circular that needs to be expanded and broken and then put back together. So he says the movement, or othering, therefore still has to appear, but in its own more characteristic form. What does this imply? That we have not in this yet attained its own characteristic form, but we've made some progress here in this paragraph. Besides this immediacy, therefore, the mediation of the picture thought is necessary. The knowledge of nature as the untrue existence of spirit and this immanently developed universality of the self is in itself the reconciliation of spirit with itself. For the self-consciousness that does not think in terms of the notion, this in itself receives the form of something that possesses immediate being and is imaginatively represented. Comprehension is therefore for that self-consciousness not a grasping of this notion which knows superseded natural existence to be universal and therefore reconciled with itself, but rather a grasping of the imaginative idea that by bringing to pass its own externalization in its historical incarnation and death, the divine being has been reconciled with its natural existence. The grasping of this idea now expresses more definitively what was previously called the spiritual resurrection in this same context, the coming into existence of God's individual self-consciousness as a universal self-consciousness or as the religious community. The death of the divine man as death is abstract negativity, the immediate result of the movement which ends only in natural universality. Death loses this natural meaning in spiritual self-consciousness, that is, comes to be its just stated notion. Death becomes transfigured from its immediate meaning, that is, the non-being of this particular individual, into the universality of the spirit who dwells in his community, dies in it every day, and is daily resurrected. In paragraph 784, we're following along the trajectory that has been outlined. We're engaging with the death of the God-man, the incarnate God within the community, and we're looking at two different ways of attaining perspective, or to use the word that Hegel is going to have to comprehend or to grasp. A lot of concept and grabbing terminology coming up here, including ergreifen, which gets used a lot, to latch onto, to grasp. And then, of course, the concept or the notion, the Begriff, and whether something is engaging in conceptual thought or whether it's, by contrast, working with images, representations, pictures, right? So what we're really talking about here is a phrase that he uses, and he's going to talk about the knowledge of nature as the untrue existence of spirit and this immanently developed universality of the self being in itself, what? The reconciliation, the Versöhnung of spirit with itself, which is really what the whole phenomenology is about, even though it doesn't say so at every point, of course, but it's what it's aiming for. And the phenomenology is supposed to be kind of a record of how, at least for some people, consciousness, spirit, has already done this. Hegel is not providing us with the, as he views it, path forward that leads to some utopian land that none of us have ever seen. It's happened already within a certain understanding, according to Hegel, of Christianity and its traditional Vorstellungen, its representations, its dogmas, you might say. So he tells us, besides this immediacy, what immediacy? The immediacy that we encountered in the previous paragraph, the immediacy of nature, the immediate, the mediation of picture thought is necessary, notwendig. It's needed still at this stage, at this point. Why? This is where that sentence occurs. The knowledge of nature, the Wissen of nature as untrue, untreu, right? Existence, Dasein of spirit, and this immanently developed universality of the self, that's the reconciliation. How does this work? So he says, for the self-consciousness that does not think in terms of the notion, the self-consciousness that is unconceptual, you can say. He says, this in itself, this an sich, receives the form of something that has two important characteristics here. One is that, both of these are a little bit longer translations, it possesses immediate being. In the German, it's just eine Seiende. It's something that has being. It's something that is, right? It's not very developed or anything like that. Immediate being, okay, that works. And is imaginatively represented, eines Vorgestellten, right? Something that is pictured, something represented. Imagination is certainly doing some work here as a faculty. That's perfectly fine. So then he goes on and he talks about what is possible for this. And here we have a parting of the ways, right? Comprehension, das Begreifen. Now notice, right? Begriff, Begreifen, the act of engaging in conceptualizing, comprehending, can go one of two ways. It could, if we were on the ball right there, it could get us to this stuff. Comprehension is for that self-consciousness, not a grasping of this notion, ergreifen of the Begriff, right? A grasping of what is graspable, wrapping our head around something. It's not that. And what would it be? He says, it's not a grasping of this notion, which knows superseded aufgehobenes, natural existence to be universal, and therefore reconciled with itself. Wouldn't that be nice if we could grasp that? Instead, we settle for second best here, and he says that instead what we get is, here we go, the grasping of the imaginative idea. The imaginative idea is just Vorstellung, right? So instead of grasping the concept, It grasps the second best, not quite as good, can't make reflexive use of itself. Vorstellung. Vorstellung's not bad, though, right? Let's remind ourselves of this. Vorstellung is great. It allows us to advance. As he just said earlier, it's notwendig. It's necessary. We do have to go through that. It's just not all there is, right? So he goes on and says, here we go, grasping of the imaginative idea, that by bringing to pass its own externalization. So what do we have here? This is a narrative that is being provided that's supposed to have meaning through bringing to pass. Now, the bringing to pass, das Geschehen, through the happening, you could also say, of this. It's not quite so agency-oriented, bringing to pass its own externalization and Äußerung, right? And here he's actually going to be using a word that the Miller translation only brings up a little bit later, divine being, Gottliche Wesen, right? The Gottliche Wesen, the divine being, is what is externalizing itself. So it externalizes itself in what? Historical incarnation, Menschen werde, literally becoming human, and its death, the crucifixion, the atonement, you could say, right? So this is Christ. This is the Christ story about God, for whatever reason, the second person of the Trinity, the Son becoming human and dying for all of us. Now, what he says there is that the divine being, the Gottliche Wesen, is now reconciled with its existence, its Dasein. And Miller adds in brackets natural existence. That works. I don't think that he needs to insist on it there, as he kind of seems to be doing. But he goes on and he tells us that the coming... Here we go. It's been reconciled with its natural existence. The grasping of this idea now expresses more definitely what was previously called the spiritual resurrection in the same context. So what is that? The coming into existence of God's individual self-consciousness as a universal self-consciousness, or as the religious community. So that is what's going on in the background. The question is, how is that religious community understanding itself in relation to the divine being, which is becoming human and allowing itself to die? How does this actually work? Is it primarily through this figure of the Christ? When you think about going into a church and seeing a crucifix with not just a cross, but actually the body, the corpus, hung on there, sometimes with many wounds and blood and lacerations depicted. What is that supposed to be doing? It's reaffirming as you walk in that, hey, this is what this is supposed to be about. Right? I think a lot of Christians, this is a bit of a side note, could really benefit from spending a little bit of time when they come into a church actually looking up there and thinking about that guy and what it is that he stood for and represented and taught to people, because much of the time they lose the thread a little bit. It becomes about togetherness. It becomes about culture war. It becomes about this and that, all these things that really don't have much to do with Christianity understood as centered in Christ, right? So, aside over, let's come back to this. He goes on and he says that the death of the divine man as death, right? So the death of the divine man as death is abstract negativity. Now, negativity is usually a pretty good thing in a Hegelian perspective, right? It gives us openness, it gives us movement. Merely abstract negativity is not all that helpful. To make a little pun here, we could say that it's a bit of a dead end, right? There's not going to be a lot of development. He says the immediate result of the movement, which ends only in natural universality, right? And what is natural universality? Well, I think we could say in this context, one way of understanding it is, hey, we're all going to die. It's going to come for all of us. We all have horizons, right? Everybody's going to either die before us or after us or at the same time. That's not something we can really do that much with in this case. But we can transform that. The meaning of death can be something different. And here's where we get to the importance of spirit as the community, which is where Hegel wants to take us through the rest of this religion section. It's not that we have to abandon completely the narrative, the depictions, the picture thinking, the imaginative exercises that people do, but we're supposed to go on to something more. So he tells us death loses this natural meaning in spiritual self-consciousness. Spiritual self-consciousness is where consciousness that is grasping the notion could have gone, will go, but hasn't quite gone yet. Hegel's prefiguring for us where we can go. Death loses its natural meaning in spiritual self-consciousness. That is, it comes to be its just stated notion. It develops into its notion, right? Death becomes transfigured from its immediate meaning, that is the non-being of this particular individual, Jesus Christ, or, any one of us, into the meaning that it has for the community. The universality of the Spirit, who, as Hegel says, dwells in his community. I mean, this is a little bit of a side note as well, but think about this. One way of understanding what Hegel is saying here is that God is too big to dwell in just one single human person, however, privileged or blessed they may be. God needs to be in a community comprised of persons who aren't all just individuals put together in one sort of aggregate. They're self-consciousness. They exist in relation to each other as well as in relation to and through the divine. So that can only happen in community. It could be a virtual community to some degree, right? If you think about religious organizations, they are not just about who's present right there, but are understood to be, part of a larger community, the church, the nation, the Sangha, whatever it's going to be, right? And it extends backwards into time and forward into time as well. So what happens there? What does death look like in this community where spirit is reconciled to itself? Spirit dies in it every day and is daily resurrected. Dying isn't just a one-time affair of this guy on the cross in Palestine. It is something that is continually happening within the community, a cyclical, cycloidal, growing upon itself sort of thing that Hegel thinks is what Christianity reveals itself to the phenomenologist as being genuinely about when we grasp it in its notion rather than just through representations or imaginations.